which you will remember is going to set America up as, and like it's kind of important that we issue this proclamation and other countries, like they all comply, you know? I mean, they do it in this sort of weird, like, well, we'll comply if they comply, and everyone sort of says that, and so we just go like, awesome, then what's on, you know, and then it moves on. But the point is that the U.S., you know, having been just, you know, 50 years before this, like really a nobody in terms of international politics, right? Like before the Civil War, does anybody in the world care about us? No. I mean, like we had just defeated Mexico, and that's sort of like not, you know, like nobody cares. It didn't make any big difference, and the country is still growing, and we're fairly isolationist. But here we are at the turn of the 20th century, and the U.S. is now influencing major, like, international decisions about influence and power and so on. So all of this, by the way, so far, everything we talked about so far with imperialism has happened under which president? McKinley! It was McKinley, not Washington. Okay, let's try that again. Everything we've learned about so far, which is essentially the fight over Hawaii, the Spanish-American War, and then pushing towards a global policy in China, all that happened under who? Who was the president? McKinley. So what you should be thinking in your brain at this moment is what? Okay. We have been, when we talked about progressivism, we started really by talking about Roosevelt as our first progressive president. Roosevelt comes after McKinley. So like in our continuum of, you know, chronology we've got going on in our head, all this early imperialism stuff, this Spanish-American War, Hawaii, China stuff, has to go in with the file of like the Gilded Age, right? That's happening before the turn of the century. It is all under President McKinley, and this is going on before progressivism really gets underway. Okay, so we had to back up to get through that story. But so now we're at the point where we're going to start talking about Roosevelt. So now we're coinciding or overlapping with the Progressive Era, right? The Progressive Era really takes off. The first big progressive legislation is going to be that Meat Inspection Act, 1906. That's under Roosevelt. So the Progressive Era is when we begin to see imperialism sort of take another turn, right? Bless you. So we're going to talk now about Teddy Roosevelt. He will, of course, assume the presidency in 1901 when McKinley is assassinated. So he had been the Undersecretary of the Navy. He had gone on to be a Rough Rider in Cuba, and then he becomes the Vice President of the United States. Everybody hates him. They call him that darn cowboy, but they don't say darn. And people, you know, are sort of upset that he's so-called one heartbeat away from the president. Well, joke's on them, because then the president died. And then he actually did become the president. And Teddy Roosevelt has a very interesting perception of the world. So we associate with President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, the idea of big stick diplomacy. And it comes from this, okay, this is a personal pet peeve of mine. Roosevelt always said an old African proverb, which, can we just stop for a moment and remember that Africa is a continent, not a country. So like, it's not an African proverb. It's going to be a proverb related to a particular tribal group, but it doesn't even matter. He probably made it up. Right. So, like, anyway, he might have even just made it up. But this thing that he said all the time was speak softly and carry a big stick, right? And so the sort of gist of that was that in his approach to foreign policy, he was super friendly and sort of magnanimous, but when push came to shove, he was unafraid to, and by that you should read, very often sent the U.S. Navy and the U.S. military in to defend whatever he perceived as American interests. So big stick diplomacy is a pretty aggressive policy, right? The U.S. is getting involved in lots of places in the Caribbean, and we're doing so in a way to advance American interests, sort of like, who cares, whoever's there before us? Like, we're going to go in and we're going to get what we want. So as part of this, he's going to develop what's called the Roosevelt Corollary. And corollary is a fancy word that means like an addition. So it's the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So he's taking the Monroe Doctrine, he's not replacing it, we're not moving away from it, but we're just sort of adding on. So while the Monroe Doctrine says non-colonization, non-intervention, so basically Europe, stay out of our hemisphere, the Roosevelt corollary says, and if anybody has to intervene, it's going to be us. It's going to be the United States. So the Monroe Doctrine said, Europe needs to stay out, don't get involved, no new colonies, don't intervene in your old ones. And then the Roosevelt Corollary says, if anything needs intervention, the U.S. is going to do it. So we're really staking this claim, right? Remember, sometimes people ask, like, why is this ridiculous unit, this period 7, all jumbled up in one thing? You know, it's a little bit like almost insane, kind of crazy. Like, why do we do all this? And the answer I didn't understand until I went to this workshop for the College Board. And the answer is that it's all about America's entrance into the world stage. So like, how does America go from being sort of very focused on isolationism and like being very inwardly focused to being really like about changing the world? And so progressivism fits in this narrative because what I'm hoping you're going to come to see as we finish this unit or this section on imperialism is that the very same like logic that drives progressivism, like we know best, we're going to solve the problem, we're going to like put our viewpoints on other people, is the same kind of idea that's driving imperialism, right? So they sort of coincide. And so then from imperialism and then into World War I and then the 1920s and then the Great Depression and then World War II, this is all the story of how America sort of comes out on the world stage and we become this major international power. Okay. The attendance office. Okay, so anyway, so the Roosevelt corollary is saying that the U.S. is going to have this really big active role in international politics in the Western Hemisphere, and Roosevelt's not afraid to use it. And here's one of the best, or like, I think the easiest example to pull. So if you need an example for like the Roosevelt corollary, I would always bring up the Dominican Republic. So this cartoon kind of shows what's going on. So during Roosevelt's first term in office, the Dominican Republic was in a huge amount of debt to a whole bunch of European powers. So they owe them a whole bunch of money. And what do you think is going to happen? Like if somebody just continues to owe you a whole bunch of money and their economy is floundering, what do you think the Europeans were going to do? Come back, right? They're going to come in, they're going to take over, they're going to try to get their money back somehow. And the U.S. knew this, and we didn't want that to happen. So what does Roosevelt do? Well, he pays off the loans, so he pays off the Dominican Republic's debts. The United States does that. And then we just take over the Dominican Republic ourselves, you know? Like, we take over their ports, we begin to assess tariff duties on their imported products and their exports, and we, like, pay ourselves back using the fruits of their labor or whatever. And so we, like, save the Dominican Republic from intervention by intervening and sort of taking over. So anyway, this is a good example of how the Roosevelt corollary sort of was applied across the hemisphere. So another big thing associated with Teddy Roosevelt is the construction of the Panama Canal. But it's kind of a funny story, and by funny I mean horrible. So here we go. So we know that Panama now is a country, but at that time Panama wasn't a country. Panama was part of another. It was a region in part of another country. That country was Colombia, right? So like if you look at my world map over here, which is tiny and half of you can't see, but so Panama is that tiny little isthmus there, and then the country right there at the northwest corner of South America, that's Colombia. So Colombia, controlled, owned, was in charge of this Panamanian region. But what you might or might not know is that the very northwesternmost part of Colombia, the part right there next to the Isthmus of Panama, is and was crazy dense jungle. Like it's almost unnavigable. Like the reason that Colombia was known as this sort of like haven for drug lords or whatever was because the Colombian government and the military had an incredibly difficult time getting into this crazy mesh of a jungle. So even at that time, it was almost impassable to get through the main part of Colombia into this region of Panama. And so the culture in the region of Panama, although they were considered to be part of Colombia, was very different. Anyway, back in the 1890s, the French had begun trying to build a canal themselves, right? So it's not like we were the only people with this idea. To get from the Atlantic to the Pacific took this really crazy long journey all the way around the southern tip of South America. So it's not like no one's ever thought of we should build this canal. But the French had a miserable time of it. So like they would build, and then like the monsoon season would come or whatever, and they would like rains would come, and it would basically completely wash out whatever they had done, and it just start over again. And then worse on top of all of that was the disease. Malaria and yellow fever especially were hugely problematic, and so scores of Frenchmen died. They can't keep enough people there to work. It just becomes, the French basically give up. They're completely bankrupt. They just give up. So the U.S. then tries to negotiate with France and Colombia to get a treaty to give us permission to create this canal. Because, of course, we want to build it, but then we want the rights to it, right? We're not going to build it for somebody else to use. We want to build it and then control it. Well, the Colombian diplomat agrees to this treaty, but when he gets back home to Colombia, the Colombian government is a little bit irritated. They're sort of thinking are you kidding me? Don't you know what happens when America gets close to you? They take over everything. This is a bad plan. We don't want to do it. So Colombia backs out of the agreement. And wouldn't you know, if there was a rebellion in Panama of these Panamanians who wanted to be independent from Colombia, And some American ships just happened to be kind of in the area, and they just happened to like blockade all of the Colombian port so that they couldn't get their ships into the water to get to the region of Panama. Because remember, they can't walk across, right? There's that big, thick jungle that they can't get through. So for the like Colombian army to go and put down this Panamanian revolution, they have to get in ships and go in the water and sail to this region of Panama. But we blocked them from doing that. And so, ha ha ha, the Panamanian rebellion succeeds. And guess who is super willing to sign a treaty with us? They are so happy. So Panama signs this treaty with us. They give us permission to dig this canal, and then we're going to have control over it in perpetuity, which is a little bit weird. But anyway, this is a cartoon that's kind of like, look at America throwing dirt on the capital of Colombia. So there we go. Anyway, but a lot of things really contribute to America's success. So first of all, again, America has had pretty good timing. You know, like, why do we industrialize so rapidly? Well, because we wait to industrialize when all of these technologies make it pretty easy to do so. Why are we so successful at the Panama Canal? Well, because when we begin building it, we have really good steam shovels and widely available like steel supports, and so the whole process goes much more smoothly. But more important even than the technology is the medical advances. Do you remember that in the Spanish-American War, what was the biggest killer of American soldiers? It was disease, right? These vector-borne diseases, malaria and yellow fever. So the American Army had done a lot of research trying to figure out what was killing these people. And so two doctors, Dr. William Gorgas and Dr. Walter Reed, had figured it out. They did all kinds of experiments, probably a lot of them unethical, about infecting people with mosquito-borne diseases. Anyway, they figured out that malaria and yellow fever are vector-borne. They are carried by mosquitoes. And so then, on top of that, they come up with a solution. If we have people sleep in nets, if we drain all the wet areas we can, and I couldn't make this stuff up, pour gasoline in all of the wet areas that we can't drain, then we can kill all the mosquitoes and nobody will get sick. And it's really effective and also terrible for the environment. But it's really effective. And so Americans don't die in large numbers as a result of disease. So like the greatest, like, in terms of history, the greatest like accomplishment of the construction of the Panama Canal is actually probably this defeat of these vector-borne diseases, like figuring out how we can go to places with large mosquito populations and not have everybody die. So that's pretty cool. Anyway, so you remember the story from back in the Progressive era, right, about how Roosevelt leaves and then and helps get the election of who? Taft, right? So Taft comes into office next. And Taft has a little bit of a different approach to diplomacy. He's not about the big stick. He doesn't want to be, his personality is not nearly so aggressive. So Taft's diplomacy is called dollar diplomacy, and it sounds pretty much like what it is. Rather than wandering on with our navy and forcing countries to do what we want by basically beating them into submission or occupying them, Taft is going to encourage American investment in other countries. So like the U.S. government itself will invest. They'll like bail out other countries or, you know, loan them money. And then they're going to encourage American private individuals, private organizations and companies to invest their private dollars. And so the thing is, like, I don't actually have to occupy your country to force you to do what I want. I could just own everything. You know, and that's pretty effective too. You know how your parents have veto power over what you do with your car? It's like that. They don't actually have to beat you to make you not go places with this vehicle. They just own the car. So they have sort of that last veto power. And so it really, it sounds nicer, it kind of looks nicer to not be sending the military all the time, but you know the end result, right? Like, if we get all invested and then something happens and our investments are at risk, then we're gonna send the military in, right? So it's not like the diplomacy has changed all that much. It's just gonna be more focused on the idea of investment. And so the so-called like banana republics, this idea of this like early 20th century like Latin American countries who are sort of puppets for the U.S. government, that's a creation of dollar diplomacy. It's this encouragement of lots of American investment. And so like it's kind of like what happened in Hawaii, right? Before Hawaii was taken over in that coup, the Americans are going to effectively control the country because of that. But then, of course, Taft is going to serve his one term. Roosevelt comes back, and he's really irritated, right, because Taft isn't, like, progressive enough for him. So then what happens? Yeah, well, Roosevelt runs for office, right? He tries to get the Republican nomination, but the Republicans don't want him. Well, I mean, some of them do, but not all of them do. So Taft gets the Republican nomination. Then Roosevelt's like, well, fine, I'll make my own party. And he does, the Bull Moose Party. And then that splits the Republican vote, which means that Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, will be elected, right? So Wilson then okay, you guys know people who are like super smart, but also cannot for the life of them figure out how to talk to normal people. You know, you just always feel stupid when you're talking to them. And like, they don't know they're being condescending, but like every word out of their mouth is condescending. You know those people? That's Woodrow Wilson. He was really smart. I teach about the presidents because we're super nerdy at my house. And he knows Woodrow Wilson as the really smart one. So Woodrow Wilson was really smart and also kind of had his head up as you know where. So he's going to have his approach to diplomacy. He calls it moral diplomacy, which already sounds condescending. And basically it's this idea that like, we're going to support like the good of the world. And don't worry, we're going to get into World War II on Wednesday, or World War I on Wednesday, and talk about how well that went for us. World War II is next week, don't worry. Anyway, so World War I is going to be a good example of like how moral diplomacy works for us. But I think that Mexico is a great example, and by that I mean it went terribly. So Mexico was ruled by this guy, and to be honest, I never remember any of their names because this is U.S. history and not Mexican history. And so anyway, Mexico was ruled by this guy who was terrible, like objectively horrible, this guy, you know, and he like, there's debt peonage and like land was dispossessed from all the native people. Anyway, it was really, really bad, but he really liked Americans. So like there's lots of American investment because the Americans would give him kickbacks and he got rich. Anyway, but then there's this revolution in Mexico. Like they want to get rid of this bad guy. And Woodrow Wilson is like all for getting rid of bad guys, right? He's so moral and he knows better than everybody. So he's like, yes, we will support this revolution. But then the thing about revolutions is somebody has to replace the guy who you kick out. And the U.S. can't quite figure out who we want to replace. And so the guy we originally want doesn't have any public support at all. So then there's the other two rebels, this guy who's supposed to be Pancho Villa, and this other guy named Emiliano Zapata. And they like live one in the north. Pancho Villa lives in the northern part of Mexico, and Zapata lives in sort of the southern part of Mexico. And they both are sort of like, I grew up in South Texas. They're like cult heroes. Like people are like really kind of like Che Guevara, but in a different way. Anyway, so like they're super like they're adored, but the U.S. doesn't like either of them because they're kind of anti-American and like believe in crazy stuff like that Mexico should benefit Mexicans. Anyway, so the U.S. like can't figure out who to support, and so now we just sort of like by sort of wavering and we're not really supporting anybody. Remember, we helped overthrow the first guy, and now we can't really figure out who we want to put in his place. And so Mexico just kind of devolves into civil war. Pancho Villa begins raiding like the southern part of the U.S. and like Woodrow Wilson sends in John G. Pershing, like General Blackjack Pershing or whatever, to go and find Pancho Villa and bring him to justice, but he can't find him because Pancho Villa like is loved by the Mexican people. And so we like sort of low-key invade Mexico, but then like, you know, sort of come back because we're really worried about getting into the like big world war that's coming up on the horizon. Anyway, in the end, Mexico's just going to have 20 years of civil war, and it's entirely our fault because we thought that we knew better than the Mexican people, and so we actively undermined the people that they tried to place in positions of power. So that's how it goes when you think that you're better than other people. I wanted to show you this picture because we remember with the baby with the bathwater that was super creeped you out. Well, I told you that Pear soap was like a big deal, and they had lots of really culturally relevant advertising. And just in case you think that they couldn't possibly be that racist, I want you to read this ad. The first step towards lightening, double meaning intended, the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness, because clearly non-white people aren't clean. Pear soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances, while amongst the cultured of all nations, it holds the highest place. It is the ideal toilet soap. Anyway, so that's kind of the idea that yes, they can actually be that bad. And then we have a tiny bit of time left, so I'm going to show you some cartoons, but one of them is here. So remember this cartoon, right? Rudyard Kipling, The White Man's Burden, Yay Racism. Well, here is, we can just take a sigh of relief that at least one person in the entire continent of the United States, or whatever, what we thought was our whole continent, got it right. Because here's my favorite cartoon from the era. It's very rare. There are very few of these, but here we go. The white, question mark, man's burden. So somebody got it right. But with the rest of our time, I'm going to show you a few other cartoons. That because students in APRISH often kind of get confused by these cartoons because it's hard to believe that America can actually be that racist. But oh yes, in fact they can be. Okay, so here's one. Go ahead and look over the cartoon. So who's this guy? McKinley, he's a waiter. It says McKinley on his towel. Who's this guy? Uncle Sam, where are they? They're in a restaurant, a nice restaurant. What's on the bill of fare, the menu? Cuba steak, Puerto Rico pig, Philippine floating islands, and the Sandwich Islands. So would you think that this cartoonist is in favor of, thumbs up, or opposed to American imperialism? So if you would give me a thumbs up in favor of, thumbs down opposed to American imperialism. No phoning a friend, think for yourselves. The answer is in fact in favor of. In favor of. So I know that to us, we're like, are you really objectifying entire countries as like pieces of meat for your like disposal? And the answer is yes. Yes, in fact, they are. So remember, if you look at the tone of the cartoon, so this is a challenge because you'll see cartoons on the AP exam and you don't want to get them wrong. Like you don't want to write that this person was like opposed because that's wrong. Look how it's like a nice restaurant. McKinley is the servant of the United States. He's just bringing to us what we want, what's good for us, nourishing. Uncle Sam looks sort of pleasant. Now, if this was supposed to be negative, Uncle Sam might have like looked evil and dastardly, or maybe he'd like have this super sharp pointy knife like cutting up like a person or something, but he's not doing that. This is all about like, absolutely America, take your pick. The world is your oyster or whatever. Here's another one. So here's Uncle Sam. This guy, you recognize him? So William McKinley, right? He's got these big pants on, he's kind of big for his britches. Texas, Louisiana Purchase, Florida, Alaska, California, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, McKinley and Company, National Tailors. Over here, the cloth, enlightened foreign policy, rational expansion. And over here, anti-expansion policy. He's got a spoon, he wants to give him some, and the caption says, declined with thanks. The antis, something, have a nice something, get thin again. And Uncle Sam says, no, like I never did take any of that stuff, and I'm too old to begin. So thumbs up or thumbs down, you think this is in favor of or opposed to imperialism? In favor of or opposed to? Yeah, this one is also in favor of. Like, I know that it looks bad because he's fat and we think fat people are not, like, is not healthy or something, but actually what he's going to get, what is the tailor going to make his new clothes out of? Enlightened foreign policy, rational expansion, right? And the aunties, you know, these people, they look kind of like shriveled up and they're offering him this medicine. I don't need any of that, Sonny. Like, look at me, I'm super healthy and awesome. So there's that. Here's this one, cover of Puck magazine. And here's the, the eagle, and the bottom says his 128th birthday, and the caption, gee, but this is an awful stretch. And he's got one wing on the Philippines and one wing over here, sort of covering up Puerto Rico. What do we think? In favor of or opposed to imperialism? This one is also in favor of imperialism. So if I say something like, why, Hannah, you look awfully pretty today. Do I mean she looks terrible? No, I mean that she looks really pretty, right? So I know that it says the word an awful stretch, but it just means like, wow, that's a really big stretch. Look how big his wings look, because he doesn't look frazzled. His like feathers aren't sticking from different directions. He's not having trouble. These places are under his wing, like metaphorically. This is like a nice idea. It's his birthday. This is all about like, woohoo, look at Uncle Sam and how much territory we control. We'll keep trying. You see what we're practicing, right? Okay. Here we go. So here's Hawaii, Cuba, and the Philippines. And it says, hurrah for the 4th of July. We're coming in on Independence Day celebrations too. And they have little like flags, and surely the irony has not escaped you about how they are not independent and all. And for fun, it also comes in Spanish. Like I cut that part off, but this was also printed in Spanish language newspapers. So are we in favor of or opposed to imperialism? I feel like you're just giving up on me at this point, I'm guessing. Because yes, in fact, they are in favor of imperialism. The irony is 100% lost on America. Like that they like this dehumanization and like the whatever, it's totally lost. Here's one. Uncle Sam, Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Hawaii. Is this cartoon in favor of or opposed to imperialism? In fact, it is in favor of imperialism. In favor of imperialism. So he is stressed out, but remember, is it good to take care of children? Should we abandon these children and leave them to their fate? Don't they need discipline? Don't wait, it gets worse. Or don't worry, it gets worse.
Which one?
Let's do this one.
Oh.
So here's the U.S. This is Hawaii. And this one says schoolhouse. In favor of or opposed to imperialism. It's hard to put your thumbs up for this one, but in fact, in favor of, right? Like, look how horrible this person is. Yes, America's working so hard, but it's like you've got to get them to school. It's our duty, that kind of thing. How about this one? It's a nice detailed one. So there's so much to look at. I think I need my magic paper. So the bottom says, school begins. Uncle Sam to his new class in civilization. Now, children, you've got to learn these lessons whether you want to or not, but just take a look at the class ahead of you, and remember that in a little while you'll feel as glad to be here as they are. And back here on the blackboard it says, the consent of the governed is a good thing in theory, but very rare in fact. England has governed her colonies whether they consented or not. By not waiting for their consent, she has greatly advanced the world's civilization. The U.S. must govern its new territories with or without their consent, until they can govern themselves. But I want you to notice a few things. Who's that? Yeah, an African-American person. This is post-slavery, so not a slave, but is he in class for civilization? No, he's just cleaning the windows. This guy? Native American, right, an Indian. And he's not in class. Where is he? In the corner, right? Like he's in trouble and he's reading his book. Yeah, upside down and backwards. That's pretty rough. Right here in the door, just looking in, also not in class for civilization. Remember that braid? We talked about the braid. Yeah, a Chinaman, right? So then, again, not even in class, but clearly not part of civilization. Back here, these nice, well-groomed little children, their states' names, Texas, Alaska, Nebraska, can't read them all, California. And then right up here, Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and there they all are, looking very not human and upset. So the general message behind American imperialism was very much like, sure, the countries might rebel, i.e. Philippine-American War, or sure, they might hate us, or sure, they might whatever, we have to be sort of rough with them, but this is what's good for them. We know better, right? And here we see that kernel of progressivism and sort of what that all started out.